Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACS Webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Michael David, and I am pleased to be your host for today's broadcast, which is being co-produced with the Science History Institute. Before we begin today, I would like to say a few words about our partner. The Science History Institute is based in Philadelphia and is proud to host the Joseph Priestley Society Talk Series. The Institute collects and shares the stories of innovators and discoveries that shape our lives, focusing on the history of chemistry, chemical engineering, and the life sciences. The Institute houses an archive and a library for historians and researchers, a fellowship program for visiting scholars from around the globe, and an acclaimed museum that is free and open to the public. You can learn more about the Science History Institute and access the extensive collection of digital content from podcasts to other Joseph Priestley Society talks at their website. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Roger Turner, a museum curator at the Institute. He studies how science and technology have shaped the modern world, ranging from chemistry labs to pollution control to weather forecasting. Most recently, he created a digital exhibit about the emerging field of mechanochemistry titled The Science of Crush, which can be viewed for free on Google Arts and Culture. Dr. Turner earned his PhD in the History of Sociology of Science from the University of Pennsylvania in 2010. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the American Meteorological Society, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Today in his talk, he will be exploring how seemingly neutral medical instruments can amplify racial bias. We also extend a warm welcome to Dr. Bill Tuszynski, the program chair of the Joseph Priestley Society, who will lead the Q&A session at the end of the program. Now, welcome, Dr. Roger Turner.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm happy to join you. Now, about a year ago, I started to cough. I was wheezing with crackly Rice Krispie sounds in my lungs. I wore a mask in my house all the time, and I was anxious. I might infect my kids. Was it COVID? Was it pneumonia? My wife bought me a pulse oximeter, and I started monitoring my oxygen levels. The machine, one night in the middle of the night, I woke up. I was shaking uncontrollably, and the machine said my pulse oxygen was 93%, lower than it should be, but not dangerous yet. The COVID tests came back negative, and that was one less thing to worry about. But one thing that I never had to worry about, because of the complexion of my skin, was whether the instrument was misreading my oxygen levels. Now, today, I'm going to introduce the history of two medical instruments, the pulse oximeter and the spirometer. They are widely used instruments that are central to the practice of medicine in the United States today. The pulse oximeter measures how completely your blood is saturated with oxygen. Blood oxygen levels have become the newest vital sign, one of the 5 basic measurements that health professionals use to rapidly assess a patient's health. The spirometer, on the other hand, measures how much air your lungs can hold and how easily it moves in and out. Spirometer measurements are central to diagnosing conditions like emphysema, bronchitis, and asthma, which afflict more than 3 million Americans a year and are a major cause of disability and death. Both of these instruments have only become more important over the last 2 years, since COVID affects the lungs and blood oxygen levels. But the design and the functioning of these two instruments are also entwined with race in ways that medical operators are often unaware of. This leads to biases and unequal treatment, not just by medical professionals, but also by insurers, disability programs, and in lawsuits. To oversimplify a bit, because of how these instruments work, people of color have to be sicker than quote-unquote white people to get the same benefits. And in the last few years, the unequal performance of these instruments has generated attention in a wide range of outlets. Medical Journal, of course, but also television news, Wired, The Atlantic, even the 1619 Project of the New York Times. In early 2021, the CDC and the FDA put out notices warning about the potential inaccuracies of pulse oximetry for dark-skinned people, partly in response to prodding by Senators Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, and Ron Wyden. And behind this outgrowth of attention is the work of two researchers, Lundy Braun and Amy Moran Thomas. They are not physicians or chemists, but researchers in the field of STS, Science, Technology, and Society, or if you've gone to other schools, Science and Technology Studies. STS is an interdisciplinary field. Its main researchers are historians, anthropologists, sociologists, plus scholars of rhetoric, language, and philosophy. STS brings together insights from the humanities and the social sciences to understand how the STEM fields function. STS begins with the insight that science, technology, and engineering and medicine are social practices, systems of human activity that have politics, hierarchies, that need funding and other forms of support to operate. The STEM fields are never separate from the broader societies in which they operate, but the STEM fields do have unusual patterns of social organization and distinctive systems for making knowledge. These create social credibility that gives STEM practitioners particular kinds of authority and influence. More simply, we might say that STS studies how knowledge and machines are connected to power. Whew, okay, now we're done with the theory part of the talk. So next, I'm going to sketch out how Lundy Braun and Amy Moran Thomas have used the STS perspective to reveal how racial inequality has been built into spirometers and pulse oximeters. Then I'll briefly try to answer my title question: can medical instruments be racist? We'll talk about how measuring tools can combine racial prejudice with institutional power to produce racism. Then I'll wrap up by touching on what we can do to make things better. We'll see a few of the solutions that people are exploring to reduce the racial inequalities perpetuated by these instruments. Let's dive into spirometry first. In its most basic form, the spirometer is about measuring how much air you can exhale. Initially, the spirometer was basically not much more than a tube connected to a can that captured an exhalation and quantified the air inside. Today's instruments also measure how fast you can exhale and inhale, how the force of your breath diminishes over time. These are all proxies for lung health. And of course, lung health matters to more than just the person whose lungs are being measured. Lung health affects how much you can exert yourself, how fast you can move around, and thus how much labor you can do. So today, the spirometer is central to disability claims and lawsuits about occupational injuries. Now, one of the big challenges in spirometry is grappling with variation. People and their bodies are different, while the volume of exhaled breath is one absolute measurement. So how should doctors define what's normal for healthy bodies in general so that they can measure how abnormal and this particular exhalation is for the body that's in front of them? This is a tricky task since there is a lot of variation in the lung function measurements over time and space within countries, within individuals, among groups, and among spirometers. Population level studies have even shown that lung function increasing in certain populations and decreasing in others during the same time period. Since the 1960s, respiratory researchers around the world have worked hard to standardize the many sources of variability. And one product of this standardization project is the practice of race correction, also called ethnic adjustment. And in the United States, many spirometers use correction factors of 10 to 15% for individuals labeled Black, and 4 to 6% for people labeled Asian. Now, to operate the spirometer, the technician inputs a person's age and height, their sex or gender, and their race. Now, how this race is entry is determined, and you can see the buttons here on the side of the spirometer right there. So age, height, race, and then sex. But how this race is determined varies, with most operators either asking patients to self-identify or the operator simply eyeballs it. The machine then automatically calculates the absolute readings into percentages relative to what is considered normal for a person who has been classified into those various categories. This calculation happens invisibly, and interviews have shown that many operators don't even know that a race correction is being applied. In short, race correction assumes that people who are classified as not white have smaller lungs. How did this assumption come to be, and what have been the consequences? STS scholar Lundy Braun examined these questions in Breathing Race into the Machine, a book she published with the University of Minnesota Press in 2014. She and colleagues have followed up that book with articles that investigate the problematic ways that race has been defined or not defined in spirometry studies and standardization drives. So let's go quickly through what she's found. To start, it's a deep story. Interest in lung capacity is pretty old, and so is the interest in racializing it. Enslaver, philosopher, and U.S. President Thomas Jefferson wrote about it in his influential Notes on the State of Virginia at the start of the 19th century. Jefferson asserted that slavery was justified in a republic because of the physical distinctions between slaves and white colonists, one of which was, quote, a difference of structure in the pulmonary apparatus. Now, this was just philosophical speculation on his part without an empirical basis until the later part of the 19th century. In the 1840s rather, John Hutchinson, a London-based physician, developed a more usable form of an instrument that had previously been known as the pulmometer. Hutchinson coined the terms spirometer and vital capacity to label the volume of expelled air. His studies uncovered relationships between age, height, and vital capacity. He also classified his research subjects according to occupation. And among his interests was how his instrument could be used to monitor the fitness of the police and the armed forces in a time when tuberculosis was the leading cause of death and disability. Now, Braun shifts your story back to the United States by exploring the research of the physician and slaveholder Samuel Cartwright in the 1850s. Quote, drawing explicitly on Jefferson's interpretive framework, Braun writes, Cartwright built his own spirometer to quantify the difference in lung capacity in slaves and whites. According to Cartwright, quote, the deficiency in the Negro, unquote, was 20%. By defining difference as deficiency, Cartwright helped to establish race as a key organizing principle for lung function measurements in the United States. An anthropometric study of Black and white soldiers in the United States Army during the Civil War gave further empirical basis to the idea that Blacks had smaller lung capacities than whites. Astronomer Benjamin Apthrop Gould, working for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, organized spirometric measurements by race without any adjustment for height or age, Braun writes, or attention to the working and living conditions of newly emancipated slaves. Gould reported that, quote, full blacks, as he put it, had lower lung capacity than whites. This he published in 1869. Picking up Gould's empirical findings, nearly 30 years later, Frederick Hoffman, who was at the time the chief statistician for the Prudential Life Insurance Company, started to take Gould's data one step further and use that information to claim that African Americans were thus unfit for freedom. According to Hoffman, quote, the smaller lung capacity of the colored race is in itself proof of the inferior physical organism, unquote. Now, Hoffman, who was an early president of the American Statistical Association, was one of many scientists whose work was widely discussed as white people were rolling back the rights of African Americans during the 1890s. Now, this kind of scientific racism was pushed back against by leading African American intellectuals at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. They pushed back against these claims of the biological inferiority of Black people. So Howard University mathematician and sociologist Kelly Miller argued that the evidence of quote-unquote lung degeneration that Hoffman cited was not an innate race trace, but a result of the social conditions in which Black people lived and worked. Taking a slightly different track, W.E.B. Du Bois argued that the empirical basis for racial claims was far from adequate. Du Bois did believe that there were physical differences between the races and that it was a subject worthy of further investigation. But, as he argued, quote, there exists today no sufficient material of proven reliability upon which any scientist can base definite and final conclusions as to the present condition and tendencies of the 8 million American Negroes, unquote. Until the physiological effects of social conditions were better understood, how could innate biological differences be judged? Yet the arguments of Miller and Du Bois went largely unheeded, and assumptions of innate racial difference in lung capacity, quote, was firmly established by the early 20th century as an ostensible fact, as Braun writes. But Braun argues that the available evidence does not allow us to answer whether other groups of people have lower lung function than quote-unquote whites or Caucasians, or Europeans. The studies that have established this as a fact have never defined, for instance, what they mean by race. Uh, Nor does it make sense to group together all the people of African descent. This ignores the vast genetic diversity of people from continental Africa. And there's also long established evidence that there's more diversity within the categories of race than there are between them. The vast majority of variation in lung function represents individual variation rather than group variation. And further, assumptions of innate difference don't take into account the racialization of employment and of exposure to environmental toxins. For instance, air pollution studies have shown that African Americans and other minoritized populations in the United States are exposed to higher levels of particulate matter and chemicals that cause lung damage, for instance. Nonetheless, by the 1970s, assumptions about innate racial differences in lung capacity had been built into instruments, disappearing so far into the black box, so to speak, that many medical professionals never realized it was an assumption that could be questioned. So, is the lesson then is the lesson that we should take away from spirometry basically be colorblind, don't pay attention to race? No, that's wrong too. And to see why, let's turn to the story of the pulse oximeter. I'll start with how the instrument works. The pulse oximeter measures the amount of oxygen in your blood as a percentage of saturation. Because of the iron containing hemoglobin, blood changes color as it absorbs oxygen. When the blood has all the oxygen it can hold, it's a bright crimson color. Without oxygen, the hemoglobin dims to a reddish purple. The oximeter detects this color by shining two lights, one infrared, one red, through your finger and sensing how much comes through on the other side. More infrared is absorbed by the oxygen-rich hemoglobin, while deoxygenated blood lets more red pass through. The modern oximeter adjusts for the ebb and the flow of blood caused by your pulse and measures the oxygen level by calculating this ratio of red to infrared transmission several times a second. But the light has to pass through your skin for this measurement to occur. And in modern fingertip oximeters, it also passes through your fingernail, so nail polish could also disrupt an accurate reading. But the problem with pulse oximetry today is that these instruments tend to overstate the oxygen levels in people with more pigmented skin. But this is a problem that particularly shows up at lower oxygen levels, not at the highest end of oxygen levels where healthy people are. So, as with the spirometer, the racial biases of the oximeter were not completely unknown to medicine. There were studies in 2005, 2007 that had begun to explore this, investigations of just how much instruments had been calibrated using populations that representative populations that included many people of color. But this information hadn't really penetrated into the broader cultures, the broader consciousness, and hadn't made really many effects on how medicine was practiced. Now, I think it was really the critical perspective of an STS scholar that helped to bring this bias to more widespread attention. So in early 2020, COVID invaded the home of MIT anthropologist Amy Moran Thomas. The pulse oximeter became an intimate companion for her family. Her ill partner couldn't sleep without knowing that she was watching his numbers and was ready to whisk him to the hospital if they should drop to dangerous levels. Moran Thomas had already been studying other technologies and their connections to racial inequity. And so she began to explore the history of the pulse oximeter in great depth after her family recovered. She published her initial findings in an article in the Boston Review that was published on August 2nd, 2020. And in that article, she sketches out a brief history of the efforts to measure oxygen levels inside people's bodies. She identifies one set of oximetry's roots in aviation medicine and extreme environment physiology, right? So efforts to what happens to bodies when they go into space, when they're deep in the oceans, when they climb mountains, or when they're exercising at extreme levels. And this set of tools was largely built around non-invasive ways to measure, right? Not actually taking blood from the body. And so two of the pioneers in developing the early instruments, the first generation of ear oximeters, was Carl Mathis, a German physiologist who first used the differential absorption of infrared and red light through the skin in an instrument developed in the later 1930s. And then this instrument was improved upon by the US physiologist Glenn Millikan in the 1940s. But both of these instruments were hard to calibrate and awkward to use. So they didn't come into widespread use. Oh, and just an aside about Glenn Millikan, which one of the things I really enjoyed discovering in the course of this research. He was the son of the Nobel laureate Robert Millikan, and he was also an avid mountain climber. So this picture shows him helping his father haul the materials up Mount Whitney for the construction of an observatory on Mount Whitney in the mid-1920s. And he was also married to Claire Mallory, who was the daughter of George Mallory, the British mountain climber who was killed trying to climb Mount Everest in 1924. And Glenn Millikan was himself an avid mountain climber, but was sadly killed on a birthday climb in Tennessee in 1947, by a falling boulder from a mountain. So this kind of points to the way that oximetry was connected to extreme environments, physical health, and physical exertion as well. But the second line of inquiry into oximetry is a set of roots in anesthesiology and clinical medicine, particularly in the measurement of arterial blood gas. These were built around much more invasive techniques. So actually taking samples of blood and then putting them in and then reading them using a spectrophotometer, with much less need to be portable or mobile or small. These were instruments where the patient was prone and you could draw blood for analysis. But it was the effort to develop more non-invasive techniques that led to the work by Takao Aoyagi in the 1970s. Aoyagi was an electrical engineer, and his real innovation was in figuring out how to correct the readings of the ear oximeter to adjust for the way that blood pulses through the body irregularly. His instrument used two wavelengths of light, and he devised the mathematical formula to correct for the pulsatile noise of the blood moving through the body, using electronics to measure the ratio of ratios between when the pulse of the blood passed through and when the blood was not rushing by. So basically, his advance was in signal processing, but it started to transform how pulse oximetry could actually be used in practical ways. So Aoyagi patented his invention, and the first pulse oximeters were brought to market in the later 1970s by his company Nihon Kodon. Although that company eventually decided to move out of that market, and it was really the contemporary pulse oximeters were really made by a range of other companies. They started to become widely produced and used in hospitals during the 1980s. In fact, by 1987, this non-invasive oximeter had become the standard of care in anesthesiology, right? This is the tool that you used if you wanted to make sure that you were not going to be successfully sued for malpractice. And in turn, the widespread use of this led to substantial decline in deaths under anesthesia. Today, blood oxygen levels have become the fifth vital sign, right? Along with temperature and blood pressure, pulse, and respiratory rate. They're the key thing that doctors and nurses use to assess the basic health of the patient. But as Moran Thomas wrote in August 2020, quote, most oximeters on the market today were initially calibrated primarily for light skin, and they still often reproduce subtle errors for non-white people. These are typically errors of 1 to 4%, where the instrument overestimates the oxygen saturation in the blood of darker skinned people. So the pulse oximeter is one more item in a line of technologies that have been engineered to work better for light skinned people than for dark skinned people. Technologies that include Kodak film and the sensors and automatic faucets. So a few months after Moran Thomas had highlighted how the racial disparities had become embedded in the pulse oximeter, in December of 2020, a study was published by physicians at the University of Michigan that really opened up the conversation about biases in oximetry. As the study found, when a pulse oximeter says 91% oxygen saturation for more than 50% of Black patients actually had a value less than 88%. And these are really important numbers. These they seem like small errors, but these numbers have been built into policy in ways that mean that these measurements can have big consequences. So now I want to turn then to my title question: can medical instruments be racist? And so I think one of the definitions that I found particularly useful, the definition of racism that I find useful to think with, was advanced by the sociologist Patricia Bidall in the early 1970s, right? And she writes that racism is racial prejudice plus institutional power. And so the instruments are not, racist in and of themselves. They don't have racial prejudice in their heart, but they are components. But because they're components of systems that are built to distribute resources and benefits, because these instruments are used to make decisions about who gets treatment, who pays for that treatment, who counts as sick or disabled, they are built into systems of institutional power, right? So, for instance, let's think about how oximetry is coupled to power. At a pulse ox reading of 88 or 89, Medicare will reimburse for oxygen, for home oxygen treatment. But if the instrument reads 90, Medicare won't reimburse you. And so, as Amy Moran Thomas points out, in effect, this means that people with darker skin have to be sicker in order to qualify for the same treatment as people with white skin. Now, the same is true with spirometry. Making spirometric measurements a definition of illness and disability, in effect, makes it more difficult for Black workers to qualify for compensation for asbestosis. And Amy Moran Thomas tells the story of how spirometry was contested and became one of the defining features in a lawsuit over asbestosis and who would be eligible for disability benefits after the bankruptcy of the steel mill at Sparrows Point in Baltimore. This is how she sort of opens her story. So this is very much the decisions and the evaluations and the readings of these instruments and the evaluations that are made on the basis of these readings matters a lot, right? It affects who has resources and who benefits and who suffers. So let's finally turn then to the question of what can we do? What are some solutions and responses to these instruments, right? They're very useful, they're very powerful, they're very important, they have good consequences for many people, but they also have harms and biases that have been built into them. Well, one strategy is very immediately accessible, very compelling, right? We can increase awareness of built-in bias, right? We can talk about and understand what are the limitations of these instruments as they exist right now. This can take many forms. It can be done through medical education, it can be done through research. This article, for instance, in The Lancet, explores some of the ways that spirometry and the built-in routine efforts or sort of routine calculation of race adjustment and race correction may harm patients or limit the ability of patients to recover from COVID-19. And again, this is an article that really draws on Lundy Braun's work and cites her research throughout it. So an example again of how STS scholarship is moving from university presses and the humanities into medical practice. And I have to say I was quite surprised by this. There's a really interesting law that was passed in Connecticut in I believe it was signed in May of 2021, and they passed a law that does two things. It seeks to increase awareness of these biases by compelling the state governments, public health agencies, and medical regulatory agencies to describe and make sure that doctors are aware of the limitations and biases of the pulse oximeter. But it also mandates that insurance decisions not be made on one value alone, right? So just the measurement, a single measurement of a pulse oximeter, reading 88 versus 91, should not be enough to decide whether or not a medical benefit is going to be covered by insurance. And I think one of the real interesting questions, and I don't know the answer to this, is how that's going to play out in regards to federal benefits like Medicaid. A third strategy for addressing these questions is to simply do a much better job of acknowledging racism in science and technology policy, and being kind of aware and clear that racism shapes the kinds of technologies that are built, the kinds of treatments that are available to people. That racism shapes science and technology in general, right? It's that science and technology are shaped by social biases. And I think one of the really promising developments on this front was the appointment of the STS scholar and the sociologist of technology and inequality, Dr. Alondra Nelson, to be the deputy director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And she kind of leads an effort across the federal government to pay attention to the ways that science and technology contribute to inequality, thinking about algorithmic bias, thinking about instrumental bias, and exploring how government choices and decisions can be made to reduce that. And then finally, we can start to think about ways to kind of come back to the instrument itself, and to think about ways to build instruments that address the full range of bodies that they're going to encounter and going to be used with. So we can actually look back into the history of instruments for alternative solutions. And I think, and this is one of the things that Amy Moran Thomas discovered in the response to and after she had published her initial article in the Boston Review, and she came back and wrote a second article in Wired that explores the history of an alternative oximeter that was developed by Hewlett Packard in the 1970s that did not introduce these racial biases that the contemporary pulse oximeter does. Like today's pulse oximeter, it's a transmittance oximeter, but instead of using 2 wavelengths of light, it uses 8. It was adjustable with different brightness settings so that it could work consistently across a range of skin colors, and it could be readily calibrated for the individual it was monitoring, rather than assuming that all people were essentially alike. All individuals were essentially alike. It also did measure through the ear instead of the fingertip. And one of the things, while that's certainly less comfortable and less easy to use in some ways, it has real medical advantages as well, since illnesses like shock and sepsis affect fingertip circulation much more intensely than they affect the ears. And unlike today's pulse oximeters, it's not built to fit the size of the average man's fingertip. That's mine. And it's not affected by fingernail polish. But this is a road not taken in instrument development, right? When the personal computing market exploded in the 1980s, Hewlett-Packard shifted its focus and stepped back from medical equipment like this shortly before it was due to release a long-planned miniature version of this oximeter. Still, the HP 47201A, this oximeter, was remained actually the gold standard into the 1980s, and it was the device against which early fingertip pulse oximeters were tested. So my hope today is that we can begin to think more broadly about history, to understand and see how history can help us to see the ways that science and technology and engineering and medicine have contributed to inequality. And I'm going to finish with a little shout out here to a project that the Science History Institute will be pursuing this coming year. It's going to be a series of a podcast season, as well as some articles in our magazine Distillations, exploring what we're calling White Coats, Black Lives, looking at how the sort of the historical roots of racism in medicine and science, and how that contributes to the persistent legacies of racism in American science and medicine. So with that, I look forward to your questions.
All right, Roger. I've got some questions for you and some comments as well. And one of the interesting comments was to note that for women mountain climbers perform the same as men do. So that was good. A point was that oximeters typically have an inaccuracy of or plus of 2%. So at one standard deviation, so 4% at 2, which in 95 is 95% of the people. So you're talking about an error of plus or minus 4%, which is on the order of the difference of 88 and 91 too, as well. One question was, how does if a person has sickle cell anemia, how does that affect the oximeter reading?
You know, that's a great question. It's not something I know the answer to. But yeah, I think that's a really that is a really certainly an important and an interesting question that could lead to further inequalities.
Are you suggesting that the instruments are calibrated differently based on the patient's race?
Yeah, so I mean, yes, they're calibrated. They're calibrated for and initially designed and developed for light-skinned people. So most of, I believe, one of the papers that Amy Moran Thomas cites is there were only perhaps two people who were two sort of non-Caucasians, right, non-white people in the calibration study for a particular pulse oximeter that was released. So whereas you know, for the earlier Hewlett-Packard ear oximeter, there were, I believe, something like 240 people that were carefully selected for a wide range of skin complexions in their testing and calibration group.
Okay, yeah, there is a comment in there that sickle cell has been studied, I guess, with the oximeter. One of the questions here is, because of the range of pigmentation in African American skin complexion, do you see a great variation even within the African American community?
That would make sense. Yeah, I mean, that would make a lot of sense. And again, right, one of the central sort of takeaway messages here, I think, is that oversimplifying, right, or reducing the true diversity and complexity of the world is really harmful, right? And so in spirometers, the assumption that all Black people, right, all people of all non-white people share the same kind of you know, share the same reduced lung capacity, just is is really inaccurate, right? And so that's one of the kinds of places where um, the social category of race erases the broader the broader biological diversity of both within white people as well as within people who get classified as non-white.
Yeah, there is a comment in here that the pulse oximetry does give variable results for people with sickle cell. So,
Wonderful to have an expert audience. I really appreciate that.
yeah, yeah. There's one comment in here I have to share. It says the Science History Institute is a worthwhile visit if you're in Philadelphia. So a little plug there.
Thanks a lot for
yeah,
yes. The museum is closed for a few more days, but we're hoping to reopen on next Thursday the 3rd. So it's
Okay.
good.
Someone noted that Agilent Technology split off from HP to carry on with the mission of analytical equipment. So I guess that's where that resides. It's if instruments such as the oximeter are biased against people of color, how can this be changed? If scientists try to develop completely new instruments, how do you ensure that race is still not a factor? And what does a person of color do if they are in need of those instruments, but do not want to be affected by the bias?
Well, and that's a great, those are hard questions. So one of the ways to start to think about this is to do testing and incorporate people of color in the testing and the development process very early on, right? So I think one of the things that's really great about that the HP newsletter that Amy Moran Thomas was citing, and that I showed the picture of the man on the treadmill with the oximeter on his ear, is that they're quite they really sort of surface the conversation that they are having in the process of developing this instrument, right? So they say, let's pay attention to the whole range of people that this is going to be affecting, right? That are going to be measured by this, they're going to be using, or that are going to be measured by this instrument, and even if and so let's make sure we're building in mechanisms that can accommodate that range of people, right? And so this is connected to other work in design where the goal is to build inclusive, right, and to prioritize inclusion and kinds of design work that can meet the needs of a really wide range of users, and making that a central part of both the design process and what's trying to be optimized there.
Here's one. Is there a current non-invasive device commonly available in medical centers that is more accurate with darker pigmentation? Since pulse ox is used as triage number, especially for COVID, as to who might need oxygen supplementation from hospital admission?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I wish I'm a historian, not a doctor, but I would like to know if that's would like to know if there are better choices that are out there, and be very curious to know kind of how this is beginning to, what effect this broader discourse is having on the development of medical devices down the road. So are there people who run companies that are changing the way that they're thinking about designing and manufacturing these kinds of instruments? That'd be a really great question.
I guess here's when we need to ask the question about the range of pigmentations and how to measure them and the cost. Should all oximeters come with a spectrophotometer to assess skin color?
Right. I mean, this is my sense is that for something like the Hewlett Packard oximeter, by using 8 channels, you can adapt. That instrument could adapt and could cover a much wider range of skin pigments. And so but certainly if you're using 8 8 photosensors and 8 beams, that's that does raise the cost, and it certainly raised the size, right? And so one of the challenges in thinking about these instruments.
Is it possible to use a color wheel maybe and have a calibration factor based on that? I realize I'm a chemist, you're a historian. Neither one of us are medical device engineers. So
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the central story here is that it, it's a story of how the different ways that social biases and existing forms of social inequality can get built into machines, right? And that's a story that's not just a story for medical instruments. This is true, of course, of lots of different kinds of things. And so this one of the famous stories that Anissa Ramirez tells in her wonderful book The Alchemy of Us is the story of how Kodak film was calibrated for white people, basically. And so the systems, both the film itself and also the developing systems and the kinds of like the process and the machines that did the developing at like 1 hour photo centers were calibrated to bring out light skin tones, and with the consequence that they really sort of underdeveloped African American skin tones, right? But darker skin tones, with real consequences for how well that film worked, right, for darker skinned people. So they didn't photograph as well, or rather, the photographs that were developed didn't look as good, and didn't bring out their features and their characteristics. So, right, we want to think about that helps us to understand the many ways and the many places where social biases can come into technologies, with unequal consequences for different groups of people.
yeah, commenting here, it seems that the inventors did not set out to harm people of color. The problem is that when it became clear that the analyses were not properly working for people of color or people with lung damage, this response was to persist in using the inadequate measurements rather than designing better methods of analysis.
I think that's right. That's right. And so that's, there are so many places, and certainly I think there are moments in the history of spirometry where, Samuel Cartwright is, and Frederick Hoffman, right? These are seriously racist people, right? And they are not interested in equality and fairness. But there are also lots of people, lots of people in these stories who are people of goodwill, right? Mostly white people of goodwill, who are not aiming to to create this kind of inequality. But as these kinds of decisions and assumptions get submerged, it becomes really hard to see where these biases are happening. And one of the kinds of places where where they often get surfaced and come out is in moments of contestation, right? So the litigation between union workers suffering from asbestosis and the steel company is a moment where you can really where what's going on inside that black box of spirometry really gets opened up and contested, right? And so with the we were talking a little bit about the lawsuit over the National Football League's settlement with the players over concussions, right? That's another place where race norming and correction has been brought to the surface. This is a familiar practice amongst cognitive scientists and professional, and medical professionals around brain injury. But it wasn't until you had this kind of high profile litigation and legal squaring off that those issues really get brought to wider public attention. So that's one of the reasons that litigation documents can be really interesting for historians and really valuable sources of insight into technical practice.
And so another question, is it possible that other hospital bedside monitors are biased in the way they measure all the parameters on patients?
I don't have any, again, I would love to have an answer for that. I think this is one of the subjects where we need more people studying this. We need more people thinking about this. And my hope is that these two cases, because they've gotten a considerable amount of attention, will raise the story of how you can, like, will raise the profile and will raise interest in studying other kinds of instruments this way. One of the things I was really interested in as many of you filled out the questionnaire when you registered, one of the things that was really I thought fascinating to see is about 2/3 of the people who registered described themselves as complete newcomers to this topic, while about another 30% or 32% described themselves as sort of passingly familiar, but not experts on this. So it's really interesting to me to see that this is still pretty new territory for a lot of people, right? I mean, you're starting to see, we're seeing stories about this in more, not the widest circulation publications, but relatively high profile places. But this is still this is a story that has not, I would say, become, this is not a story that is pervasive yet. It's not familiar to a lot of people.
A plug here. It says, I just want to say thank you because my daughter will be starting college for biomedical engineering in the fall. She's in high school. I'm taking notes for her. She's also an artist, so she really understands how pigment and light affect things. And this is great for me to pass on to her.
Oh, wonderful. Well, good luck to her. I hope she joins this field and makes great contributions.
Another comment, the story of how the use of the device has evolved past its original intent. They were originally used as trending devices because of their high uncertainty, only because you can carry in your pocket now and get a cheap one for $50. Has it been inappropriate in YMHO used for diagnostic or screening applications?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great point. It's also a reflection, I think, of the ways that technologies become pervasive. One of the ways that technologies become powerful is they become pervasive, right? And so this was true actually in spirometry as well, as the development of cheaper and widely and easily used spirometers in the kind of the end of the 19th century through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, really helped to move spirometry from this kind of unusual, not widely deployed category into something that came to have real social power. And so we want to think a lot about what kinds of instruments can be made cheaply, what instruments get widely produced, and those are the ones that arguably we should pay the most attention to. Right? That's a kind of an interesting tension in the history of technology. Is should we pay attention to things that are really widely used, or should we pay attention to things that are really expensive and really fancy and really the most advanced cutting edge engineering, things like that? And I certainly come down on the side of let's pay attention to what's really widely used as opposed to what's most cutting edge.
There's another comment citing also that facial recognition software is not as good at recognizing dark skin and also leads to bad outcomes for Black people when it's used in security.
Yeah, and this is a really lively and important discussion that's happening in the sociology of technology right now, and in the history of computing, is paying attention to the ways that ostensibly neutral algorithms guide choices about power and the application of policing, the role of surveillance. So there's really great literature out there, and places to learn more.
A comment also, this supports the need for diversity in the workplace. These questions would have been asked during development if the workplace was more diverse.
Yeah,
I don't agree.
I would absolutely agree.
Have there been any studies showing the negative effects of death etc. of this standard? Is there a source?
I would really encourage you to check out Lundy Braun's more recent work in terms of and some of her stuff is very is accessible. Certainly her book is very engaging, and you can get it from a lot of academic libraries or order it through interlibrary loan. I don't know, I don't know that off the top of my head, but do Google Amy Moran Thomas and around on this topic and see what's out there.
So, Roger, if you have any final thoughts before we sign off.
Sure. I mean, I guess I just want to thank everybody for coming out today very much, and to say that this, the central message here is that technologies are not neutral, and they are not they no matter how much they may seem objective, they are never detached from the societies and the systems of power that produce them. And so we need to pay attention and think about the role that instruments play in the provision of benefits and who and how who and how develops them, and who they're tested on and how they're used. Right. So we got to pay a lot of attention to these sorts of things. Instruments make lives better in a lot of ways, but not always. And paying attention to race in the many ways that race works in our society is really central to creating a better world.
Thank you for watching this presentation. ACS Webinars is provided as a service by the American Chemical Society as your professional source for live weekly discussions and presentations that connect you with subject matter experts and global thought leaders concerning today's relevant professional issues in the chemical sciences, management, and business.